Now we're ready to begin discussing the microbial diseases of the nervous system, moving into Chapter 22. Just to give you a very brief background on the nervous system for those of you that may not have completed an anatomy and physiology course or it's just been a while, I want to go over just a couple things. Your nervous system is composed of your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. That means that when we're talking about diseases of the nervous system, we may be discussing diseases that affect the brain, the spinal cord, or any of the nerves in the periphery of the nervous system. Also, your central nervous system is protected by what we call the meninges, in addition to, of course, bone and a blood-brain barrier. Your meninges are several different layers of tissue that surround your brain and spinal cord. Within your meninges, you have what we call cerebrospinal fluid. So we will often see an effect of a nervous system infection as swelling of the meninges, which is not necessarily swelling of the brain or the spinal cord, but these layers that surround the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the nervous system is set up really well. It's quite protected. With your bone, your meninges, and the blood-brain barrier, it's very difficult for a microbe to get into your central nervous system. The nervous system is, probably technically speaking, the only sterile system in your body. There is never supposed to be a microbe in your nervous system. Now, if you do get a microbe in the nervous system, since it is absolutely not supposed to be there, you are going to have pretty devastating effects to a nervous system disorder. A lot of times, and some common things we see with these nervous system infections, we will see blindness, different levels of learning disabilities, paralysis, and often death. A couple common terms we're going to see throughout this chapter are shown here at the bottom of the slide. Whenever an infection has led to inflammation of the meninges, the layers around the brain and spinal cord, we will call this a meningitis. Whenever an infection causes a swelling or inflammation of the brain itself, we will call this encephalitis. If we see inflammation of both, we will call this meningoencephalitis. Now moving into our diseases. There is what we would consider a common group of infections called bacterial meningitis. Recall, meningitis is just an inflammation of the meninges. A bacterial meningitis can be caused by pretty much any bacteria getting into the meninges. There are some more common bacteria that we see making their way into the meninges than others, but it can be truly caused by any bacteria. Bacterial meningitis was considered always a fatal infection before we had antibiotics. Now that we do have antibiotics, if the condition is caught in the early stages, antibiotics can completely cure a bacterial meningitis and you may not see any permanent damage or permanent side effects. However, there are, of course, many layers in between that. You can have someone that keeps the bacterial meningitis for an extended period of time before they are cured, so they may keep some effects of the bacterial meningitis that stick with them for life. Whenever a bacteria gets into your meninges, your first symptoms are going to seem pretty normal, pretty flu-like. You will see fever, headache, things of that nature. As the disease progresses, people often complain of a stiff neck, and it turns out that's one of your more common or more hallmark symptoms of meningitis. You can also see nausea and vomiting as the disease progresses. When you get further into the disease, you will often see people begin to have convulsions, and they may even fall into a coma. Of course, death can occur from bacterial meningitis. I've listed on this slide the three most common bacteria we see that are associated with bacterial meningitis here in the United States. The first one is Haemophilus influenza. Haemophilus influenza is a normal microbe found in everyone's respiratory tract. However, in some young children, they are not resistant to the Haemophilus influenza traveling from the respiratory tract into their nervous system. Because we started seeing large amounts of young children having bacterial meningitis associated with this Haemophilus influenza, we have developed a vaccine against the infection. A second common cause of bacterial meningitis is Neisseria meningitis. Neisseria meningitis, again, is a normal microbe of the respiratory tract, but can, under some circumstances, move into your nervous system. This particular bacteria produces an endotoxin when it begins to infect the nervous system. The endotoxin itself does not cause permanent damage to the nervous system. The endotoxin just allows us to have a sign that really points to this being caused by Neisseria meningitis, and that is a rash in the throat. This is an extremely common bacterial meningitis we see in college students. There is also a vaccine available for this infection. The third common cause of bacterial meningitis is Streptococcus pneumoniae. Again, normal microbiota of the respiratory tract, occurs mainly in young children due to their depressed or underdeveloped immune systems, and there is also a vaccine available for this bacteria. Our next bacterial disease is called Listeriosis. Listeriosis is caused by the bacteria Listeria monocytogenes. Listeria monocytogenes is commonly found in processed deli meats, hot dogs, and canned meat. This is something you should never give to very young children or pregnant women. They have to be properly cooked in order to kill the Listeria monocytogenes. As a healthy adult, if you eat processed deli meat or an uncooked hot dog or canned meat, the Listeria monocytogenes present in the food will not hurt you. Could possibly give you a food poisoning type effect, but cannot cause any permanent damage. But in very young children or sometimes in immunosuppressed people, pregnant women, you can see the Listeria monocytogenes leading to many different broad types of meningitis, neurological damage, and in the pregnant women we can see stillbirths. It's a pretty devastating disease if you are in the correct category to be affected by this infection. Our next bacterial disease is tetanus. Tetanus is caused by Clostridium tetani. You can contract tetanus by coming in contact with the bacteria or the endospore produced by the bacteria in the soil. Once the bacteria or the endospore gets into your body, it moves into your nervous system, affecting the nerves that connect to your muscles. What we initially see are tremors, and this is because the nerves connected to your muscles begin to rapidly fire out of control. So you'll see some mild tremors in possibly the fingers, or other extremities can move into violent convulsions. The way this disease progresses is eventually the body becomes paralyzed into this arched back position. Instead of the neurons firing uncontrollably at the muscles, the neurons just hold the muscles in a contracted position. Once you're in this position, you will die from a paralysis of your respiratory muscles. This disease can be treated with antibiotics, but it has to be treated in the early stages. In the United States, this disease is most of the time prevented by a vaccine called the DTP. This DTP protects us against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. We will discuss diphtheria and pertussis in the respiratory system chapter. The vaccine keeps us protected on average for about 10 years. You need to get a DTP booster at least every 10 years. Though this is not necessarily a problem in the United States, in many parts of the world they do not get a DTP vaccine, and tetanus is still a pretty devastating disease. There is an interesting video, if you are a subscriber to my YouTube account, that you can watch on tetanus, and it explains to you how tetanus still affects people in different parts of the world. Our next bacterial disease of the nervous system is botulism. Botulism is caused by the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. Clostridium botulinum is found virtually everywhere, specifically in the soil as well as all aquatic sediments. You can get different types of botulism because it is found in so many different places. It can enter your body in different ways. The most common way that botulism is transmitted is by ingesting either the endospore produced by the bacteria or the exotoxin. This exotoxin happens to be a neurotoxin. Once you ingest the endospore or the exotoxin, the body is going to go into what we call placid paralysis and then eventual death by, again, paralysis of your respiratory muscles. The most common places that we see this bacteria located in foods we eat are in processed sausage. This is if they're not processed properly. Now we've started adding some chemicals called nitrates into our processed sausage, so they're typically not going to contain the items, the botulism bacteria. In improperly canned items, you can sometimes find the Clostridium botulinum endospores. This is mostly going to be a problem in your home canned foods. Industrially canned items get to such high pressures when they are being canned that we do not often see botulism. The most common place we see Clostridium botulinum now in today's times in the United States are in honey. As an adult, this is typically not going to be a high enough concentration of the endospore or exotoxin to harm an adult. But children under 2 years of age should never be fed honey. Just a little side note, something that I would never test you on that I found interesting as I was putting together the PowerPoint presentation. Most of us know that we use this Clostridium botulinum toxin to treat wrinkles. This is what Botox is. But now we have started using this botulism toxin to treat people that have constant headaches, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. Pretty interesting research. Our next bacterial disease is leprosy. It is caused by Mycobacterium leprae. This bacteria prefers slightly cooler temperatures, so it likes to grow in more of your extremities when a person actually has Mycobacterium leprae. This disease lives mainly in people, but it can be found in the wild, often in armadillos. Sometimes you get really close, so you get a close look at an armadillo. Sometimes they have pretty messed up looking extremities, and that's because of the leprosy that they're carrying. There is 2 different forms of leprosy. Most people, when they first get the disease and it first starts showing signs and symptoms, we see neural leprosy. Neural leprosy causes a loss of sensation in certain small patches of the skin, and that's what we see here in this picture. The progressive or long-term form of leprosy leads to disfiguration of the fingers, disfiguration of the toes and the feet, and sometimes some of your facial features. This disease, though it is a communicable disease, something that can be spread from one person to another, it is not a contagious disease. You have to be around someone for very extended periods of time to get leprosy. Now we're going to move into our viral diseases of the nervous system. Our first viral disease of the nervous system to discuss is poliomyelitis. Polio is one of those diseases that most of the time does not cause too much damage to the person that contracts the disease. 99% of the people that contract poliovirus only exhibit mild symptoms like headache, sore throat, fever, nausea, almost like a severe food poisoning. In rare cases, usually less than 1% of the people that contract viral polio, they are going to get what we call the paralytic form, and they are going to have crippled, deformed limbs that typically do not have much function. There are also cases of people that end up with paralysis of their respiratory muscles, and they die from polio. Polio is contracted from ingesting fecal contamination. As we could spend a lot of time talking about the history of polio, but I only want to do a small amount of it just to go over the different types of vaccines that we have. The first vaccine that was developed against polio was called the Salk vaccine. The Salk vaccine was an inactivated virus. There were some cases of people that got polio from the vaccine itself. So once we came up with a better vaccine, of course, we quit using that one, and our second vaccine was the Sabin vaccine. This was an oral vaccine. It did not protect you quite, did not give you quite as much immunity against polio, but there was no chance of getting polio from the vaccine. In the 1980s, we decided that polio was eradicated from the United States, so we stopped vaccinating against polio. However, now in the United States, we started seeing cases of polio again. So starting in the late 90s, we did begin to vaccinate against polio. Now we use kind of a combo vaccine. We took some things from the Salk vaccine and some things from the Sabin vaccine to develop our new vaccine. This picture at the top here is also part of the history. Very interesting if you're interested in looking up some information about it. These are iron lungs. The development of the iron lung is what allowed people to live with polio when the iron lung was first invented. It allowed people to be able to continue to breathe even if the virus, the polio, was paralyzing their respiratory muscles. Our next viral disease is rabies. Rabies is what we used to consider a fatal encephalitis. It is transmitted from an infected animal bite in the animal's saliva. Animals that typically carry the rabies virus in the United States are raccoons, bats, dogs, cats, squirrels, many different ones. What typically happens is when you get the bite, the rabies virus is transmitted from the infected animal's saliva into your skeletal muscle. It then moves from your skeletal muscle into your nerves, into your nervous system, leading to encephalitis. It causes changes in the person's personality. We will see periods of agitation followed by periods of calm. One really crazy symptom we see with rabies is hydrophobia. Hydrophobia is a fear of water. And it is sort of guessed that the reason the virus induces the hydrophobia is to prevent the person or animal infected from drinking water. If you drink water, you're going to wash your saliva out of your mouth, and remember the saliva is how you're transmitting the disease. So it's kind of crazy that the virus could cause you to not do something that will make it harder for the virus to be transmitted. There is a vaccine against rabies that is only given to people that are considered at risk, such as veterinarians or people that are around these animals all the time. If you are bitten by an animal that has rabies or is suspected of having rabies, you will be given a series of anti-rabies vaccines as well as immunoglobulin vaccinations. And these, from what I understand, are pretty painful, but they can prevent the encephalitis from occurring in humans. This little picture here is just to show you the progression of rabies. So in this example, the animal here, the dog, was infected with rabies. It then bites you. It goes through your skin, connective tissue, muscle, into your nerves, replicates in your nerves, gets more and more deadly, moves into your central nervous system, starts having an effect on your brain. Some of the viruses move into your mouth so that they can go into your saliva, and hopefully you can infect someone else. Remember, when we're talking about viruses, the virus is just interested in progressing itself, moving into a new host. I put these pictures here because most people think that I'm not going to get rabies. The only way to get rabies is to get bit by a rabid dog, and that's really uncommon. That doesn't happen in the United States. So I wanted to show you the areas of the United States where we do see rabies infections every year. Okay? And the different colors show you the most common animal that is transmitting the infection. The dark orange here, this is raccoon, rabies that originated in a raccoon. The light yellow here is rabies originating in a skunk. The dark colors here, rabies originating in fox and skunks. And then here in Alaska, rabies mainly coming from fox. And then down here showing you, again, dogs, cats, these more common animals we have come in contact with every day. They are much less likely to be the culprit for you getting rabies than some other animal. More viral diseases that affect the nervous system are clumped together and all considered arboviral encephalitis. Arboviral encephalitis are viral diseases that are spread by mosquitoes. All of these infections cause the same sort of signs and symptoms. We see headache, chills, fever, and then a possible progression into mental confusion and a coma caused by the encephalitis of the infection. I don't want to go into too much detail with these, but I wanted you to see that the disease name we give it differs by the mosquito that transmits the virus and the reservoir for the virus. The one we're probably most familiar with here in Mississippi is West Nile encephalitis. West Nile typically lives in birds, rodents, and some large mammals. So the way you would get this infection is the mosquito would bite a mammal, for example, that is infected with West Nile, and then it would come bite you. Other types of encephalitis infections are typically going to be found in birds, horses we see a lot of times, but depending on where you are in the United States, it's going to depend on your likelihood of coming in contact with one of these infections. As you can see, the colder the temperature, the less likely you are to get an arboviral encephalitis, and that is simply because you're less likely to be exposed to a mosquito. There is no treatment for an arboviral encephalitis. Really the only thing that we can do in these situations is try to decrease the number of mosquitoes we have in a region. There is one protozoan disease of the nervous system that we are going to discuss, and this is called African trypanosomiasis. African trypanosomiasis is caused by Trypanosoma brucei. This is a flagellated protozoan. Shown here in the picture, this is a picture of red blood cells with the flagellated protozoan in this person's blood. Trypanosoma brucei is transmitted by the bite of a tsetse fly. When you first get bit by the tsetse fly, you have very few symptoms. Within a day or two of the flagellate being introduced into your bloodstream, the flagellate begins to feed on your red blood cells. Your immune system then begins to fight this infection. You get fever, headaches, and different things like that. The flagellate, once it has fed on your red blood cells for a day or two and you have fallen into a coma, the flagellate then moves to your central nervous system and begins to cause a deterioration of your central nervous system. Death is almost inevitable once you fall into the coma. This is treatable, but most of the time the disease progresses so quickly that a treatment cannot be administered fast enough to cause a difference in the disease. Our last protozoan disease is called amoebic meningoencephalitis. This is caused by the protozoan Naegleria fowleri. Difficult to say. This is an amoeba that is found in recreational freshwater. Recreational freshwater means freshwater that is man-made, such as a man-made pond that does not have fresh water flowing into it naturally and fresh water flowing out of it naturally. This amoeba infects your nasal mucosa as you swim in the water that contains the amoeba. It then moves from your nasal mucosa to penetrate the brain. Once it's in the brain, it begins to feed on your brain tissue itself. This is a chronic infection that slowly gets worse, and it is typically fatal. Once you begin to see signs or symptoms of the infection has spread to the point that it cannot be treated at that point.